The first one, probably one of the most well-known, the pre-tribulation rapture. You can see here what we have is a chart that gives you 3.5 years and 3.5 years for a total of 7 years, the final 7 years of human history as described by Daniel the prophet. And within that 7 years, we've talked about what's important to understand is when does the wrath of God begin? Pre-tribulationists view the entire 7-year period, the first 3.5 years to the midpoint and beyond, all the way to the end, as God's wrath. So therefore, if we're not appointed unto wrath by God, believers would be raptured pre-tribulationally, which means that they would be raptured before the final 7-year period of human history, and they would believe that the entire 7 years is the wrath of God. The next one, mid-tribulation rapture. Mid-tribulation rapturists believe that the time of God's wrath begins at the midpoint, exactly at that point, and there's something there called the abomination of desolation. We'll talk about that in future videos. But that midpoint is where they believe the rapture takes place, and they only believe that God's wrath takes place from that point until the end of that final 7-year period. That's mid-tribulation rapture. And then post-tribulation rapturists believe that the entire 7 years, once again, is the wrath of God, but they put the rapture all the way here at the end, the second coming of Christ, the rapture of the church, all the way at the end. I think that this position also has some significant problems with it because we're not appointed unto God's wrath, but to obtain salvation through rapture. And therefore, this view has the body of believers going all the way through the entire 7 years, through God's wrath, and being raptured at the end. The view which I espouse is the pre-wrath rapture of the church. And here again, you have the full 7-year period of time. That is not shortened. You have it broken down into the first 3.5 years, the beginning of sorrows, brings you to the midpoint, again, the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, which triggers the Great Tribulation. And at the end of the Great Tribulation, that time period, the Great Tribulation, is cut short. We talked earlier in this video that the term tribulation is not a biblical term only as it relates to calling the entire 7 years the tribulation period. But the Bible does use a term called the Great Tribulation, and that's a specific time period that starts at the midpoint and runs to an indefinable period of time. And it's cut short by the rapture of the church. And so here you have the pre-wrath rapture sometime in the second 3.5 years of this full 7-year period of human history. You have the rapture of the church, God's wrath. Again, we don't know the exact day or the hour, but based on clear indicators in Scripture, which we'll talk about in future videos, we believe that sometime in this window, in the second 3.5 years, that the rapture of the church will take place. So those are the 4 main views. Again, pre-wrath, post-tribulation, mid-tribulation, and pre-tribulation rapture. Again, we cannot stress enough just how critically important it is for believers to have a clear understanding from Scripture about this future time. The Scriptures teach believers will enter the 70th week, will encounter the Antichrist, and will endure persecution, and will be raptured by God before He pours out His wrath upon the earth. There is an urgency in this hour of history, but most Christians in America have been desensitized to the danger ahead. If we as Christians think we're going to be taken out of here before things get tough, we will not prepare as we should, like a well-trained soldier who knows he or she may be called to the front lines. The realization that the church will encounter the Antichrist and endure a significant portion of Daniel's 70th week will dramatically impact the way we live today. For most Christians, life is centered on the daily issues of managing finances or improving marriage, achieving career goals, raising kids, planning for retirement. Obviously, these are all vitally important. But if you understand that you and your family may be among the final generation of believers who will face the difficulties associated with that future 7-year period, which will incidentally be centered in Israel and the Middle East and spread throughout the world, then you will be far more intent on watching and discerning the news as earth-shaking events begin to unfold. Current events are rocketing us toward the last days. If you want to understand the chronology and sequential flow of God's prophetic plan, then you must seek the answer to this question: when does the wrath of God begin? Does it start at the beginning of the 70th week or sometime inside of it? It is true that no one knows the specific hour or day of Christ's return. But contrary to the popular belief of most Christians, Scripture does give us clear indicators to know the general time period of His second coming. Once we determine from Scripture when the wrath of God begins, the timing of the rapture and other prophetic pieces fall into place.